Hi there, welcome to the second part of the Week 2 lectures. This lecture is titled, What is Culture? And we're going to be looking at all the different concepts of what culture could possibly be. So let's get started. Many theorists still debate on how to define what culture is. This is not an easy task, because culture, according to Erikson, is at many times invisible. Our own culture can even be invisible to us because it appears in our habits and we don't often pay attention to our habits. Moreover, culture can be revealed through historical traditions. Erikson calls it the sedimentation of historical experience. So that's when a historical tradition becomes like a rock, solid and founded within the people that are part of that group. Many aspects of culture are visible, and many of them are invisible. And I think it's the invisible ones that educators are learning to identify. Erikson was very clear when he states that even though not every culture has the same amount of power or prestige in the minds of different societies, everyone is cultural and everyone is multicultural. No two people of any group are the same. To say that all Puerto Ricans have the same culture is erroneous, because as individuals, they are also multicultural beings. The cultures that each one of us has contributes to the way that we learn. Our cultures are shaped through education. Erikson states that it is not possible for individuals to grow up in a complex modern society without acquiring differing subsets of culture. So now that we understand that culture is a part of every individual, and of that there's more than one culture in every single person, we need to work on defining what culture really is. There are 7 different prevailing conceptions of culture described by Erikson. The first he called culture as cultivation. In layman's terms, this is known as what we would call high culture. Examples could be the ballet, the opera, going to a museum. Usually, these are interests valued by the upper class. However, low culture also exists, which is also called popular culture. This is where we see different artifacts such as rock and roll, hip hop, even cowboy boots. These different artifacts represent the different subgroups of cultures within the United States. The second concept of culture is culture as a social science. This idea looks at culture as part of the daily lives of every individual in every social class. Erikson gave the example of the Brothers Grimm collecting folk tales from the German peasants in the mid-18th century. In the past, the traditions and speech patterns of the lower classes were mocked by the aristocracy. Yet, through the collection of these folk tales, there was a change, and now the lives of the lower classes were gaining more respect and interest. Culture, in this sense, was a generational transfer of what Erikson calls a social symbolism, where the individuals were passing down from generation their cultural values. The third concept of culture is culture as information bits. This idea of culture considers that within a group, the information is chunked into different little bits, and the individuals that are a part of that group receive the information that's available to that group, but not every individual receives every chunk of information. The example that Erikson provides was with regards to language. Let's say in a language community, you have a group of people, but within that group, there are different dialects of the same language. And within each group that speaks a dialect, every individual speaks what they call an idiolect, meaning that every individual has their own way of speaking. Even though they speak the same language, no two people speak the same. The fourth concept is culture as a symbol system. This idea of culture focuses on the overall patterns within a system, or within a group of people that give meaning to everyday life. This concept focuses on what they call the core symbols that are accepted by that group. The fifth concept is culture as models for action and emotion. This is the idea that we become emotionally attached to the customs and traditions we learn within our culture. It suggests that there will always be an emotional response and stimulus with regards to learning. The sixth concept of culture is culture as distributed along lines of power in society. Erikson provides the example of this type of understanding of culture when he talks about the difference between what a plant manager would know how to do and what an assembly line worker knows how to do. This is what he would call the cultural capital assigned to an individual's place in society. The seventh concept of culture was culture as residing in local communities of practice. This is the type of culture that results when individuals in small communities are influencing one another. As an educator, I would liken this to how every class that I teach is different, even though I'm teaching the same subject. Every class has its own specific culture based on the students that are represented within that small group. Even though social scientists still can't agree on a clear definition for culture, what Erikson says we can point out is that culture can be thought of as construction. It constructs us, and we construct it. Erikson points out that usually it is the invisible aspects of culture that cause the most confusion when diverse groups mix. After reading this, I thought about an iceberg. We see the top of it and we think that's what's there, and we don't realize that 80 to 90% of the iceberg is under the water, all the things that we don't see. As an educator, I try to remember that my students are like icebergs. What I see on the surface is not even close to all that makes up who they are. When different cultural groups meet, there can be two kinds of joining together. There can be a cultural boundary, or there can be a cultural border. A cultural boundary, as defined by Erikson, is any existence of a cultural difference. A cultural border is when there is a type of political power play between the two cultures. The example presented by Erikson was the political cultural border between the United States and Mexico, where on one side of the border speaking Spanish is rewarded, and on the other side of the border speaking Spanish is kind of stigmatized or punished. Erikson points out that many people think of a change in culture as culture loss, as if water is dripping out of a bucket and is slowly becoming empty. He proposes that the bucket is never empty. As the culture transforms, the people change with it. Now, I love concrete examples, and I love how Erikson did a good job of showing us how we can pay attention to the invisible culture of our students as well as the visible culture. One concrete method was to have the students write critically reflective autobiographies that talk about the histories of their family. Through the investigation of their own lives, students can make connections not only with themselves, but through the sharing of their stories, they're going to make connections with one another. Once the educator becomes aware of that student's specific cultural background, that becomes what is called a daily round, or kind of the index of that student's distinctive cultural repertoire, as Erikson called it. This type of in-depth look at your students can become a form of community action research. When a teacher addresses culture in their classroom, using such methods like having their students write a cultural critical autobiography, they are taking the time to recognize the different cultural boundaries that exist within their classroom. An educator can turn a cultural boundary into a cultural border when they begin to place a moral rightness on one culture over another. Many times, the academic language used by teachers in the classroom is presented to their students as the right way to speak, whereas the home language of different students is represented as the lowest form of speech. In these situations, many students resist learning what Erikson terms the language of power. The most effective teachers in this scenario are those who would consider and teach language as situational. One language is used for one situation and the other at home, but neither is morally right over the other. Thank you for your time, and I hope now that we've discussed culture in depth, you can keep these ideas in mind as you decide how to become a multicultural teacher.